Be inspired, supported, and empowered. This is the Global Healthy Living Foundation podcast network.
Welcome to The Health Advocates, a podcast that breaks down major health news of the week to help you make sense of it all. I'm Stephen Newmark, Chief Policy Officer at the Global Healthy Living Foundation. Our goal is to help you understand what's happening in the healthcare world to help you make informed decisions to live your best life. Today's conversation is educational. We're discussing a recent regulatory milestone involving an investigational therapy that has been submitted to the FDA for review. We'll explain the process and help make patients make sense of what these headlines actually mean. Our guests today are Erich Horsley, CEO of Biosplice Therapeutics, and Dr. Yusuf Yazici, Chief Medical Officer of Biosplice. Mr. Horsley, as I mentioned, is the CEO of Biosplice, a biotechnology company focused on developing novel therapies for musculoskeletal and other serious conditions and diseases, including osteoarthritis. He brings more than a decade of leadership experience across biotech, pharmaceuticals, and healthcare innovation, with a background spanning decades in private equity, corporate strategy, commercialization, and late-stage drug development. At Biosplice, he oversees the company's strategic direction, operations, and regulatory strategy as Biosplice works to address conditions with significant unmet patient needs. Dr. Yusuf Yazici is the Chief Medical Officer of Biosplice Therapeutics and a practicing rheumatologist with extensive experience in clinical research and patient care. He is internationally recognized for his work in inflammatory and degenerative joint diseases, including osteoarthritis, and has led or participated in numerous clinical review trials evaluating new therapies for chronic musculoskeletal conditions. Dr. Yazici has led the development of Biosplice's innovative osteoarthritis drug for the past decade through 11 clinical trials and now the regulatory approval stages. In addition to his role at Biosplice, he brings a patient-centered perspective grounded in decades of treating people living with chronic pain and mobility limitations. Well, welcome. Thank you for being here, both of you, today.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you very much.
We hear a lot of scientific headlines, especially when it comes to new drugs, but very few of them explain what's actually happening behind the scenes. Today, we're going to slow this down. Recently, a new drug application, often called an NDA, was submitted for an investigational osteoarthritis therapy called Lorsivivant. I hope I pronounced it correctly, but if not, one of you will correct me, right?
Lorsivivant.
We'll call it Lor for today to make my life a little bit easier. Now, for patients, this NDA process raises questions. What does that mean? Is this a decision? Is this access? Are we still years away, or is something sooner coming on the horizon? So to help unpack all of this, we'll get into it. To start off, could you briefly introduce yourself? I gave little bios before we started, but if you have anything to add, at least if you might mention how long you've been working in this space, what do patients with osteoarthritis most often tell you about their experience, and so forth. We'll start with Mr. Horsley, the CEO.
Sure. So I've been here about a decade. My background, as you mentioned, has been in private equity, where I've kind of grown and developed companies for many years. But Biosplice is quite unique. Biotechs, they don't typically have any revenue. What they do is they raise money and they invest in the development of drugs. And very often, biotechs develop a drug in the early stages and flip it to a pharma company. We're one of the very few biotechs to design, in this case, Lorsivivant, our asset for OA, really from scratch. So we designed the molecule, we discovered the science, we took it through phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, and now it's on the doorstep of approval with the FDA in the form of an NDA application. And so that is what makes us a bit unique. As we'll get into, arthritis is an extremely difficult disease to develop in. We've run 11 clinical trials over the years, all very well controlled, US-run, placebo-controlled trials. And we'll get into the data and what that means for patients, but it's been a long journey, and we're just thrilled to have this asset potentially available for patients after approval, because there is simply nothing out there for patients that is both safe and effective, in my opinion, and we'll talk a little bit about that more. But we're really thrilled to be able to potentially put forth this asset.
And Dr. Yazici, can you tell us a little bit more about your background, particularly as a rheumatologist in working with OA patients?
I'm a rheumatologist by training. I've been with Biosplice for close to about 12 years now, but I've been a practicing rheumatologist for over 25 years. And osteoarthritis is a very common condition. It is the most common joint disease that rheumatologists see. It can be in the hip or the knee. Knee osteoarthritis is more common than the hip, and that's what we're working in right now. And what happens basically is these patients really do not have any good options to stop the progression of the condition. Now, you may be familiar with rheumatoid arthritis, which is another inflammatory condition which affects about 3 million or so patients in the US, whereas knee osteoarthritis is about 25 to 30 million. But we have, over the last 20-25 years, developed many disease-modifying drugs, and familiar names are Enbrel, Humira, Remicade, and such, which have changed the course of rheumatoid arthritis. No such drugs have been available for osteoarthritis, even though there are more than 10 times the number of patients. So that's a huge unmet need. And the current therapies, as we can talk about, are not very effective and have potentially a lot of adverse events. So that has limited their use and the benefit they provide to osteoarthritis patients.
You know, it's always fantastic when we hear about new therapies coming out in this space, or any space really involving diseases. I just want to dig in a little bit more about what is a new drug application. When you hear that a company has submitted a new drug application, what does that actually mean? What is an NDA in plain language?
So you can think of it as the final document that's the combination of years of both starting with animal studies, then going over to human studies, and multiple phases of human studies. And we have been doing it for close to 10 years. That's, if you look at the literature, that's the average time it takes to take a drug from the very beginning, when it's just a molecule, through all the stages that you're required to go through to get it to drug stage where it can be used in humans. So you start first with animal studies, that where you show the safety of the drug, you find the dose that's appropriate for human use, and then you submit those to the FDA, and they review it. And if they agree that this is safe enough and there is potential for efficacy, then they allow you to start testing in humans. So the next stage is, first you do the human trials where you look at the safety, and when you establish the safety in humans, then you go to larger numbers of patients where you look at the efficacy. And for osteoarthritis, the major efficacy that any drug in osteoarthritis has to show is in improving pain. However, that's not usually the only thing that's wrong in the disease. There's functional impairment, there is structural damage that happens to the joint. So we have been able to show benefits in all those areas. But those are what's called the phase 2 and phase 3 trials. And you usually do multiple of those. And you need to get at least a minimum number of patients exposed to the drug so you can establish a reliable safety data set. And then you meet with the FDA when all of this is done, and you go over your data. You tell them that you're going to prepare the package for submission. They give you pointers. They ask you to do certain things, which we've gone through all those stages. Then you basically work on it. So we last met with the FDA the summer of 24. It took us about a year and a half to put the NDA package, the new drug application. You also, in addition to all your clinical data, you have to manufacture the drug to certain specification and quality. So if it's approved, then it's available and those quality measures are in place. So we have been doing that in parallel also. So you put that data, the manufacturing data, the animal data, the human data, all into this large document, which in our case is about close to about 100,000 pages. Then you submit it to the FDA, which we have done December 31st, 2025. So about a month ago. And then the process is in the FDA's hands. And what they do is they take the first 60 days to do kind of a technical review of the package that you sent to decide if it's reviewable, because it has many parts. There are certain programs they want specified and how the package is submitted so they can review it appropriately. So they go over that. So after 60 days, what's called they accept it, which means they file it. So we submit, 6 days they file, and that filing is what starts the official FDA review clock, which usually is about 10 months. And that's what we expect is going to be happening. So in March, we're hoping to be filed, then 10 months to March, which takes you to end of this year as the first time we will be hearing if it's approved or not. And after that, of course, then it becomes available for patients to use.
So just for clarification, we are looking at, if all is successful, all goes well, we are looking at approximately a 2027 date of launch for the therapeutic itself.
Early 2027.
Early 2027.
If we're lucky, it could be late 26, but that's roughly the timeline.
Okay. Well, that's helpful. You know, it's also, as a side note, it's a reminder of how extensive the FDA process actually is in terms of reviewing for safety and efficacy. So that's always great. Let's talk about osteoarthritis itself, because there are millions of people, of course, living with this condition. I once had a doctor tell me, you may not have osteoarthritis today, but if you live long enough, you will. It's as hard to avoid as getting gray hairs, is what the doctor actually said to me. You mentioned the current treatment landscape and where it's lacking. Why has OA historically been such a difficult disease to make progress in compared to other chronic conditions?
That's a very good question. So up until recently, osteoarthritis was felt to be, well, it's just part of aging. There isn't much you can do. Everybody ages, just like you can't do much for the white hairs. Joint gets worn out, it gets painful, and people felt it was part of just the aging process. But now we know that osteoarthritis isn't just a simple wear and tear disease. Wear and tear, of course, does play a role. Obesity is a risk factor. Trauma in the past is a risk factor. There are some genetic risk factors, but it's a complicated disease in that there are inflammatory events that are happening that contribute to the pain and the cartilage degeneration. There are changes not in the cartilage in the joint, but also the bone and the other tissues around it. So it's been realized over the last 10 to 15 years that it's not a simple wear and tear age-related condition only. That has led to identification of a lot of targets of things that are going wrong in the knee that could be targeted with medications. So the last 10 to 15 years has seen a lot of new drugs coming into clinical trial space. When we first started, there were about 8 to 10 other companies with other drugs that were starting out their clinical trials too. Right now, as far as we know from publicly available information, we're the only ones that have finished phase 3 and submitted an NDA. There are some earlier phase ongoing work with some other molecules. So there is a lot of interest for sure, especially with the realization that this is a more complicated disease than people have assumed. Not only that, about half the patients with osteoarthritis of the knee are younger than 65, which is they're in their productive years, they're working, they really functional limitations doesn't do them any justice. So it's a serious unmet need. That's one of the reasons FDA recognizes osteoarthritis as a serious condition, because it's also been shown to increase not just morbidity, but mortality. Osteoarthritis, in addition to, because it affects the function, patients don't move around as much, it just makes things worse overall and contributes to coronary artery disease, diabetes, and as a separate risk factor. So this has also led to more interest in osteoarthritis. So we're hoping we're leading kind of the wave of potentially new drugs that will come into the osteoarthritis field. The other issue has been all the currently available drugs for osteoarthritis only try to treat pain. The most common ones are non-steroid anti-inflammatories. However, they provide short-term pain relief and they have potentially a lot of side effects. They can impact gastrointestinal stomach bleeding, they can impact the heart, they can impact the kidneys, blood counts, they interact with other medications. So most rheumatologists and orthopedists use these at the lowest dose for the shortest duration of time. Then we have opioids for pain, but as you know, because of the opioid crisis, it is very hard to use opioids for anything really other than oncology-related pain. And they do have a lot of side effects, of course. Then there are a couple injection options. Corticosteroid injections into the joint, into the knee, are very commonly used. But even though they do provide about 6 to 8 weeks, let's say, pain relief, maybe sometimes out to 3 months, repeated uses of corticosteroid injections have been shown to actually damage the cartilage. So it's a balance that we have to hit by we have to and want to help the patients, but we might be damaging the joint even further. And then the last one is the hyaluronic acid derivative injections, which are approved as devices because they kind of are supposed to improve the lubrication in the joint. We use them too. There are several of them approved for use. However, they're not really supported by the American College of Rheumatology or American Association of Orthopedic Surgeons, because even though they're safe, the efficacy data has always been questionable in some people's mind. So, but we still use them. I use them because patients really do not have any options and they might help. Now, all of these are to help the pain. There is nothing available, very unlike rheumatoid arthritis, where the drug actually stops and even reverses the damage to the joint structure itself. So if you have a drug that helps with the symptoms, so pain and improves function, and improves the structure, that's what we call a disease-modifying drug. So that's what we feel lorsuevant is the first one, because in our clinical trials, we have been able to show improvement in pain, improvement in function, and improvement in structure. And that's kind of the holy grail, because we want to improve the symptoms, of course. But if we could slow down, stop, or reverse the damage, that would, of course, mean a lot more to the patients down the road, because it would also avoid the ultimate treatment option that they have when everything fails, is the knee replacement surgery.
And just to be clear, this notion of improvement in structure may not mean much to the layman, but what we've studied, and really the endorsed way by all agencies to study structural improvement in OA, is to mimic what the orthopedist will do when you go in to see him with OA in the knee. They take a frontal x-ray. In the case of our clinical trials, we use a fixed positioner to take a frontal x-ray, and we look at, in our case on a blinded basis, the joint space, the space between the femur and the tibia, because in between those two bones, which show up on the x-ray very well, is cartilage. And so what you do in clinical trials is you evaluate whether that joint space is narrowing, in which case it would be disease progression, or leveling off, or potentially improving. And we see, in our case, the leveling off and improvement of joint space width in a very robust long-term 2-year phase 3 trial.
Wow. I mean, that's really exciting. It's like hard to even contain myself, to have an opportunity like this for OA patients and future OA patients to come. So thank you for what you're doing. Erich, I want to ask you a very specific question from an organizational standpoint. What does it take to responsibly move a therapy from research into regulatory review and potentially to approval without over-promising to patients?
Sure. I think it takes very careful attention to clinical trials, running them well, running them responsibly, usually in the US or Europe, using a robust number of patients, not counting on a small number of patients to have this kind of outlier result, ideally doing that over years, which we've done. And we really are led by the science and our data. And it happens to be that both the totality of the data and individual studies happen to really point in the right direction, that this is a safe drug that can and should be approved for patients. But you have to lead with the clinical data first and not just hopes and dreams and pseudoscience. So it really, as I mentioned in our case, we started from identifying a number of really attractive mechanisms that cause OA, addressing those with a small molecule inhibitor we have in lercivivant, formulating the drug properly to make sure that, in our case, the drug stays in the joint, is not available systemically, leading to a very attractive safety profile, monitoring both the pain effects, the functional effects, the structural benefit over time, and letting that data lead the way. And then at the right time, which for us is now, communicating that the availability of that data, the fact that hope exists for patients, and that it's in the hands of the FDA. We're not approved yet. We're hoping to be approved. So we always kind of mention to patients where we are in the process. We get thousands of emails from patients asking, when can this be approved? I really need this. And we usually respond with the same sort of response, which is we're working on it, we're trying, it's in the hands of the FDA. Patients have a voice, and they should articulate that voice.
Okay. Yeah, I wanted to ask about that. Yeah, I mean, very important question for our audience. What can patients do, if anything, to help accelerate just generally drug innovations in the space?
Absolutely. So patients vote. And patients can call their congressmen and senators, and patients have an influence over the attention that the FDA may pay to certain disease areas. And let me just back up a minute. So we are at a state of innovation in OA that has gone nowhere essentially for 30 years. The last approved novel drug in OA was in 1998. We're still using that today. What other area have we been satisfied with 30-year-old technology? I mean, think about 30 years ago, we were using rotary phones. Cars had, 8 miles per gallon gas mileage, right? There was no internet. There were no flat screen television. Would we be happy just pausing development for 30 years in any other walk of life? No, even rare diseases have made a ton of progress. You look at rare oncology diseases. You look at a number of difficult disease areas. And here we have this disease OA that's gone nowhere in this amount of time. And it's because it's a very difficult disease to develop in. And I also feel it hasn't gotten the necessary attention, not from pharma companies, not enough, not from biotechs. It's very expensive to develop in this field, and potentially not for regulators. I hope this is a new day, but patients have a voice and they should exercise that voice and demand better.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That's very helpful for our audience. What are we likely to hear from the FDA between now and the approval, if anything? Or is it just we wait and hear and potentially raise our voices?
No. So once the review process starts, so the FDA is in touch with us, basically asking questions about the data. They look at our analysis. They have access to all of the data. They run their own analysis. They bring up questions. They might ask for additional analysis. But not only that, in that 10-month period, they also audit both us, the clinical trial sites, the manufacturing sites. So there are FDA visits that we meet them there, we prepare, we answer their questions, they come and review everything. And towards the end, maybe 2-3 months before that, there is also the opportunity to have what's called an advisory committee meeting. Now, we have proactively asked for one. Advisory committee meeting is a public forum where patient advocates, physicians, a group of experts that makes up the committee basically hears how the FDA is interpreting the data and how we're interpreting the data, and the FDA asks them various questions to answer. So they use AdComs usually to help them when needed to make their final decisions. So that's a public meeting, so that would be heard and people can log in and watch, and we've watched many of them for other drugs in the past. And patients can sign up to make statements, which is very common too. And those all we feel are important because it's important to discuss the benefits, the very good safety data, the benefits ratio where there's efficacy and very minimal to no potential side effects should be heard publicly. Patients should opine on the unmet need that they feel. And so that's another milestone during the review period. And then all of that's taken into consideration. Then you discuss the label with the FDA, what the actual package insert that pharmacists give to doctors and patients is going to say on it. And then the 10 months is done, hopefully when it's done, and then we get a final decision.
This is great. Again, I hope I'm not repeating myself when I keep saying this is very exciting, to say the least. Before we wrap up, I want to bring this discussion back to patients. If there's one thing you would want people living with osteoarthritis to take away from this moment, what would that be?
Let me opine on that in a very personal way, and that is OA is not something you just need to accept. It's not simply a fact of aging. It's something that you can fight and you can actively seek better treatments for. And the personal aspect here is that I'm an OA patient myself. So I'm 53. I've had 2 knee replacements already, the likes of what Lindsey Vonn got. And my phenotype was really just wear and tear, maybe bad knee genetics. But about 15 years ago, I started having some pain. I ignored it for a while, kept running on it, kept skiing on it, etc. And by the time I got to an orthopedist, I was, pretty close to bone on bone, and it was a dismal experience. And I think this will resonate with a number of your listeners. What I experience is what many patients do, which is this long litany of drugs that don't really work, are bad for you, maybe bad for your organs, bad for your liver, bad for your gastrointestinal system. In my case, I got several corticosteroid shots, felt great temporarily, and then it got worse, and it just went down this road. And the doctors, of course, want to push off knee replacements as long as possible. I'm pretty young to get one, to say nothing of 2. And it's a really, really tough experience. And I went through, all the HAs, all the knee braces, and whatever you can. It's really, really, really disheartening. But there is hope now. So don't lose hope. Don't simply accept it as a fact of growing old, because it isn't. There are many factors that can lead to it. Of course, you need to exercise as much as possible, lose weight if you're overweight, etc. But there is hope for patients, and hopefully we are on the cusp of bringing that hope to reality. And so I just want to deliver that positive message for folks.
Wow, that's very powerful, to say the least, and thank you for that. And with that, I'll just say thank you both so much for joining us and for all that you're doing for osteoarthritis patients and for helping bring clarity to a process that can feel overwhelming for patients.
Thank you.
To our listeners, milestones like an NDA submission matter, but they are part of a longer, careful process. Staying informed, asking questions, and partnering with your healthcare provider remain the most important steps you can take. As always, we'll continue breaking down the health issues that matter to patients without hype, without shortcuts, and with transparency. Thanks for listening to The Health Advocates, a podcast that breaks down major health news of the week to help you make sense of it all. If you found this episode helpful, please leave us a rating or review and share it with someone who cares about healthcare policy. And be sure to follow us wherever you get your podcasts. You can find all of GHLF's podcasts at ghlf.org/listen. I'm Stephen Newmark. We'll see you next time.
Be inspired, supported, and empowered. This is the Global Healthy Living Foundation Podcast Network.